Okay, time to get started here on the Panther-Lair Post-Game. A rare midweek Panther-Lair Post-Game. Not our first midweek Panther-Lair Post-Game. We've done midweek Panther-Lair Post-Game shows before, like after a Thursday night football game. But if this is our first midweek, our first post-game basketball, our first post-basketball post-game show, I guess is the way to say it, a basketball post-game show, our first one. Well, we didn't exactly pick the best game to kick it off. I thought it would line up perfectly. I thought it was just sort of the perfect convergence here where we do our Wednesday night show all the time. We always do a Wednesday night live show. And here Pitt had a basketball game, a road basketball game, so I wouldn't be at the game. Be in the home offices, the Panther-Lair offices. We could go live right after the game and have something to talk about. And boy, for the first 20 minutes, it looked like we were going to have something fun to talk about. It looked like, well, this was going to be a real lively, exciting, fun post-game show with, lots of people will be tuning in and we'd have lots of conversation and everybody would be excited. It'd be a lot of fun. And the second half happened. And I can't say that second half was very encouraging. You know the results already. Pitt lost to Duke. 77-69 was the final. Panthers covered. Right? They were plus 8.5 in this one. And they covered, so good teams win, but great teams cover. I don't know if Pitt qualifies as a great team here in this one. They were a great team for a half. They were a great team for a half. And we'll get into the first half versus the second half, what happened in this collapse, how Pitt went from leading by 11 to losing by 8, how they got outscored by 19 in the second half, how they got out-rebounded by a million. And even if that number is not exactly accurate, it sure felt like it was a million. We'll get into all of those details, of course, during the Panther-Lair post-game show here. We'll take your comments and questions. You got them on the chat screen there, right up on there on your right-hand side of the screen. Start putting your comments and questions in there. You can be a super chatter if you want to make sure we get to your comment or answer your question. You can do all of those things. And we'll get to your comments and questions in a minute. I'll give everybody a chance to roll in here and start posting their comments and questions. We've got a lot of people who already have, so we appreciate you getting started early. It's glad to see some people jumping in right off the bat. And I mean, the first word that comes to mind here is disappointing. I mean, this was disappointing. You take an 11-point lead at halftime at Duke, you should win that game. You should be able to hold on. You might not be able to do everything you did in the first half. You might not be able to score. What do they have at halftime? Pitt had 43 at the half. You might not be able to get 43 in the second half, but you should be able to score, better than Pitt ultimately ended up doing, scoring 26 points in the second half. You might not end up beating Duke by 11, but if you have an 11-point halftime lead, you should be able to hold on and secure the victory. And Pitt was unable to do that for a variety of reasons. And so that's why the first word that comes to mind with this is disappointing. And it's disappointing because it was an opportunity. And, we'll go back and forth about this. And this is something you'll see a lot probably over the next 24 hours. You've probably already seen it a lot. That, a lot of people saying, look, if you take the stretch of Carolina and Virginia and Clemson and Duke, these 4 games, and if you had told people at the beginning of that 4-game stretch that Pitt would go 2-2, most Pitt fans would be pleased with it. And that's where they ended up. 2-2 coming out of that stretch. Obviously with the 2 wins against Carolina and Virginia and the 2 losses to Clemson and Clemson and Duke, excuse me. But as we've talked about so many times, those scenarios where you say, if I had told you that X would play out, you would have taken it. Those sort of hypotheticals, you can't really, I don't know, they ring hollow to me because your expectations change. I think if anybody, when you say that, boy, if they had gone 2-2 in this 4-game stretch, you would take it. I mean, your expectations changed when they won the first 2 of those games, when they beat North Carolina at home, and when they beat Virginia, and the way they beat Virginia, coming back from a 12-point deficit in the second half and winning. That changed the expectations. Going 2-2 wouldn't feel as satisfying when you started 2-0, because that would mean you lost 2 games in a row. And then when you look at the way they lost them, the long scoring drought in the Clemson game in the second half to ultimately cost them, and then, whatever this was in the second half here, and it was a lot of things. It was rebounding, it was Duke's defense, and it was totally stagnant Pitt offense that we're going to talk about quite a bit here, as the cause for this loss, this defeat. But that changed the expectations. When you beat Carolina and Virginia, it changed the expectations for what this stretch might provide. Now, Pitt still comes out of this at 4-2. They still have a stretch of winnable games coming up, at Georgia Tech, at Louisville, Florida State at home. Those are their next 3 games over the next, week and a half. And those are winnable games. Each will present its own challenges. 2 of the 3 are on the road, but those are all winnable games. And so, Pitt's not in a terrible position. I mean, they very well could end up 7-2 or 6-3 in the ACC, and you still feel like they're moving along and playing well. But as we sit here just minutes removed from blowing an 11-point halftime lead at Duke, you're not really thinking, boy, they can still be okay. You're thinking, geez, imagine if they were 5-1 right now as opposed to 4-2 with a win at Cameron under their belts. And so that's, the first thing that comes to mind out of this is disappointing. And more than concerns, long-term concerns, big picture concerns, I just say in this particular instance, they blew a great opportunity. An opportunity to get a really good win on the road, no matter what you think of Duke. If you go down there and you play against that team in that building and you get a win, you've accomplished something. You've gotten a good win. I mean, that is a good win to get. Not to mention what it would do for their overall record, for their ACC record, and kind of rebuilding some momentum after they, took a bit of a hit in that Clemson game. So what happened in this game? I mean, I think if you watched the second half, I don't think there's a lot of mystery. I mean, Pitt's offense went into a hole. And Pitt's offense went into a hole because they just stopped doing anything. It became just possession after possession of Nelly Cummings and Jamarius Burton trying to take one of Duke's big guys off the dribble and never actually being able to get around them. And when they couldn't get around them, they had to try and shoot, and they couldn't shoot over those guys because they were giving up 5-6 inches to them. And it was possession after possession of that. There was no ball movement. There was no moving away off the ball. It was a stagnant offense. And, credit to Duke and credit to John Shire for making the adjustments to, contain Pitt's offense in that way, adjusting to where Pitt was having success in the first half and taking a different defensive approach against what the Panthers were trying to do. And, whatever the opposite of credit, on Jeff Capel and his staff for not finding a counter. I mean, at some point, you see what they're doing. At some point, you've got to find another way to move the ball around, and the ball just wasn't moving. They had 7 assists in the first half and finished the game with 9. So 2 assists in the second half for Pitt. See who had them. Greg Elliott and Jamarius Burton. Each guy had 1 assist in the second half. I mean, the ball wasn't moving. It wasn't good ball movement, and the offense got stagnant. And you can't do that against a good defense, And I think Duke has a good defense with their size, where they were really able to use their size. I think Jeff Capel wasn't concerned. I mean, he was concerned about Duke's size, but he was more concerned about the physicality or the lack thereof. I think he felt like Clemson was a more physical team, and so maybe some of the things Clemson was able to do against Pitt's offense, Duke might not be able to do because they might not be quite as physical. Tony Bennett talked, the Virginia coach talked about how physical Pitt was in that game that Pitt won. And so I think Jeff Capel thought, okay, we're going to have a size disadvantage here, but we should be able to make up for it with some physicality and our shooting and the way we move the ball. Well, they weren't moving the ball, and they were getting out-physicaled, and it ended up with, just a poor offense that went, how long? They went, almost 7 minutes without a single point in the second half, where the score went from, Pitt up 8 points, 52-44, to Duke leading 59-52. A 15-0 run that was at that point. And then they went, I think, 8 minutes without making a field goal. And that's where the game was lost. That's where the game got away. You couldn't count on Duke committing 12 turnovers in the second half the way they did in the first half. I don't think you could rely on that happening. And maybe you might not even count on yourself shooting north of 50% in the second half. Chances were good, I think, going in halftime. There was a pretty solid chance that the second half was going to be more even affair than the first half had been. But you still can't afford to go 8 minutes without a field goal. You can't afford to go 7 minutes without a point and hope to preserve a lead, let alone actually win a game. And that was the hole that Pitt fell into. And their offense never really got on track in the second half. That doesn't mean their offense is doomed. That doesn't mean that all the things they've accomplished and the success they've had and when they've looked good, what they've seemed to be good at, that doesn't mean that those things don't count or aren't attributes of this team. It just means that they're going to need to find new ways to answer when teams try to do defensively what Duke did. And not everybody's going to be able to do what Duke did. Not everybody has, Filipowski and Lively and Young to be able to defend out like that. Filipowski's a very unique player. There aren't a lot of guys like Filipowski. There aren't a lot of guys who can move like Lively. Not everybody has players who can challenge Pitt in that way. And that's a good thing for Pitt. Duke is a challenging matchup because of the way those guys can play. But I think Jeff Capel has to realize that they need a counter to that. They need to figure out a way to adjust to that when that's what teams do. And so that's one of the lessons that has to be learned going forward. The announcers talked all night about the lack of a post presence, about how Pitt doesn't really have a scoring option inside, and that's true. And that continues to be true. And that's where they're missing John Hughley. Federico is not going to provide that. Guillermo Diaz-Graham is not going to provide that. Like the announcer said, they don't run plays for those guys. In the second half, I would contend that they didn't really run plays for anyone for a good portion, particularly in that 8-minute stretch that they went between field goals. They don't. They don't have a center who can score, who's going to be a focal point of the offense. It's going to be tip-ins. It's going to be, dump-offs, things like that. But they still need to run some kind of offense. They need to attempt some kind of ball movement and try to get shooters open. They weren't trying to get, I'm sure they wanted to get shooters open, but it sure didn't look in the second half like there were concerted efforts being made through plays that they ran to get open looks for shooters. Blake Hinson, the best set plays that created opportunities for him were inbounds passes. And I think he only took 1-3 off of an inbounds pass in the second half. And he missed it. The other times he would do a shot fake and try and drive when they had those baseline, out of bounds plays. The blobs that our guy Steven Gertz always likes to talk about. Run plays for Greg Elliott to get open for baskets. Jamarius Burton and Nelly Cummings, I think, are really good players. They've been really good for Pitt this year. And Pitt's going to need them to be really good. They're going to need to lead the way. But it can't just be a game of 4 guys standing around the perimeter while Cummings or Burton tries to take a guy off the dribble. Sometimes you can do that, but that can't be your game plan. That has to be something that those guys identify and say, here, I have an opportunity. I'm going to do this. That can't be your game plan every time up the court. Just, hey, everybody just stand around and have Burton and Cummings make a play. And I can't imagine that's what Jeff Capel was telling them to do, but it sure was what they were doing. And you see the result. It was ineffective because it became too easy. It became too easy for Duke to defend because they knew what was happening, and Pitt didn't seem to really have any interest in sort of deploying all of the weapons it has. And we've talked all season. We've talked through 17 games now of how many weapons this team has, of how effective this team is, and of how dangerous this team can be, how they have a lot of threats who can do a lot of things. Nike Sabandi can do a lot of things. Burton and Cummings can do a lot of things. Greg Elliott, is a really good shooter. Blake Hinson can do a lot of things. They've got a bunch of weapons. They weren't really doing much to try to deploy them. They weren't giving themselves the best chance. They were just, for a large portion of the second half, seemed to be counting on Burton and or Cummings to bail them out. Didn't work. Not necessarily a good plan. And certainly not while the other team has as much momentum as it has. And when you have no, rebounding advantage whatsoever. You look in the second half, Pitt had 4 offensive rebounds. They missed 20 shots from the floor, in addition to 2 free throws. And I think both of those were the front end of 1-and-1s. Is that right? Either way, you have at least 20 offensive rebound opportunities, and they got 4 in the second half. You can't, you've got to run plays for better shots than that. And I know that's been a common criticism of Jeff Capel over his 4 years, is that he doesn't, at times you just look at it and say, what is the offense they are running here? And again, our guy Steven Gertz, who does amazing film breakdowns for us at Panther-Lair.com, and he'll have a great breakdown of this game, I'm sure. Steven point out, the plays that they're running, what they're attempting to do. But there were just way too many possessions in the second half here where it didn't look like they were attempting to do anything. It was dribble, 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 try to drive and turn it over, or, heave up a bad shot. And that's how you get an 8-minute stretch without a made field goal. That's how you get a 7-minute stretch without a friggin' point. And that's how you end up blowing an 11-point lead and losing a game by 8. So I think there are obvious lessons to take from this game. I don't think you can completely ignore how Pitt played in the first half. I mean, it was a clinic. They played really, really well. They were shooting well. They were getting inside well. You look at their first half stats. I mean, they had, 3 3-pointers out of 10 attempts. So they were 14 of 20 from inside the line. And this is after, the Clemson game, where I think they went, as I've often pointed out this stat, they went the first 17 minutes with only one field goal made inside the 3-point line. And this game in the first half, they go 14 of 20 from inside. They're getting baskets all over. Nate Santos has a nice drive. He has another nice drive that he dishes to Guillermo Diaz-Graham for a basket. I mean, they were playing well, really well in the first half, taking advantage of Duke's turnovers to some extent. But I honestly think, Duke had 12 turnovers in the first half. I think that did more to keep Duke's point total down than it did to help Pitt's point total. Pitt only got 8 points off of those turnovers. Wait, I think Duke actually had, how many turnovers did they have in the first half? Duke had 12 turnovers in the first half, excuse me. And Pitt got, 8 points off of the turnovers. That's just not, you're not capitalizing. But despite that, and despite the rebounding advantage, they were still able to build an 11-point lead because they were shooting well, they were passing well, they had 7 assists on their 17 baskets. They were just playing really well. But when Duke adjusted and stopped turning the ball over and started scoring themselves, Pitt couldn't score to keep up, to preserve the lead, to stay ahead, or to ultimately win the game. And so the result is a loss. Now Pitt falls to 11-6, right? 4-2 in the ACC, and they've got to go, back to the drawing board. They have to figure some of these things out. They have to come up with a plan on how they're going to counter when teams make these kinds of adjustments going forward. All right, let's get some chat comments in here. See what you guys are talking about. Michael B is a super chatter. We appreciate him jumping in right off the bat. He says, let's see. Michael B says, hi, Chris, happy New Year. What did you think of the officiating in this game? What did you think of the coaching or lack thereof in the second half? And is it time to start worrying that Pitt might choke and collapse again? I know Pitt fans are already worrying about the collapse coming. I mean, it's inevitable. I feel like, all those texts and tweets have been saved in your drafts to send as soon as, the first sign comes. What happened in this game? They went on the road to the toughest venue in the ACC. They jumped out to a big lead, but they couldn't hold on to it because the opponent played better than them in the second half. As I said, all I'm going to take from this game is that it was a disappointing loss because it was a missed opportunity. There's still enough that I've seen out of this team through 16 and a half games, give or take a couple halves here or there, and certainly after the first 3 or 4 games. But there's enough I've seen out of this team that I say I think they're still built to have some success in the ACC this year. I still think they're a really good shooting team. I still think they have a really talented backcourt. I still think they've got a really good 6th man off the bench in Sparks Savandi, which is the new name that I've given him. I'm going to beat it into the ground until it catches on with anyone else. And believe me, the more you complain about it, the more I'm going to say it. Blake Hinson's a really unique guy. that they've got to get involved more. They've got to run plays for him. It can't just be, and this goes for the whole team. It can't just be. It's not just roll the ball out there and see what happens. But it can't just be, all right, you try to drive, see if you have somebody to kick to. That can't be the play. It has to be more than that. There has to be a method to it. There has to be an offense. I mean, they have to be more organized than they were in the second half. And maybe we overlook some of it when the shots are falling, when they're having success. And, and it just sort of comes up when, in a game like this, particularly the second half, where things aren't going down, where the shots aren't falling, where they're not having that kind of success. Maybe it sort of stands out more. I mean, I think they could do more with the weapons they have. I think they could generate more sort of planned offense. I'm not, looking at collapse. We always like to say things like, well, this game's going to tell us a lot. This game will tell us who this team is. And this game will tell us, this game will tell us. I don't think the Duke game was the one that was going to tell us who Pitt is. Now, this stretch coming up, Georgia Tech, Louisville, Florida State, this is the stretch that's going to tell us a whole lot. It's not going to tell us everything about who this team is because they'll still have a ton of games left to play after that. You know what I mean? That won't even be halfway through the ACC schedule. But this stretch here is 3 winnable games. 2 of them on the road, but 3 winnable games. And that's going to tell us quite a bit about this team. They need to respond with a good win. And I don't mean that in terms of a quality win, but a solid win, an impressive win at Georgia Tech on Saturday. They need to bounce back. This team's leadership, its veteran, experience, and all of those things that we've talked about with this team, it's all going to be sort of front and center when they go to Georgia Tech, and they have an opportunity to rebound from this loss on the road. Because if they are the things we've said they are, if they have the leaders we've said they have, if they have the togetherness, everybody said they've had, if they have the offense we think they have, if they have the defense that they've seemed to have, they're going to go down there and they're going to win. And then they'll be back to pretty much where we think they are, a top half of the ACC team. And they'll have an opportunity to build on that at Louisville, and they'll have an opportunity to build on that against Florida State at home. This is a big 3-game stretch coming up. And I mean, we're going to say this about every 3 or 4 game stretch that they've got, but particularly in the wake of 2 losses, back-to-back losses, that saw some disappointing collapses in the second half of the games. Not talking about the season when I talk about collapses. Some disappointing collapses in the second half against Clemson and Duke. This team needs to respond. They need to come out with an answer, at Georgia Tech to kind of build back some of the momentum that might be starting to slip away. And it's funny to see that this team has struggled in the second half these last 2 games. That these last 2 games have been lost in the second half when this team has been such a second half team for the most of its stretch. After you get past those first 4 games, the stretch up until basically the Clemson game, they were really good in the second half and won a bunch of games in the second half. They were trailing at halftime in I think at least 4 games, or maybe 3, and ended up coming back and winning them. The Virginia game certainly among them, the Carolina game among them. Even the Syracuse game where they sort of fell apart in the second half, they were still able to rally and hold on to get a win there. And so it's, a bit surprising to see them fall apart in the second half like they did here tonight. But I think it comes down to a few of those things where Duke made some adjustments defensively, and Pitt never really countered. They just kind of kept hoping for breakdowns that would allow them to drive to the basket or pull up for a 3, and those breakdowns didn't happen. And so, I think, who was it, Michael B., I think part of your question was about the coaching or the lack thereof in the second half. And I mean, I think there was probably, there were some things lacking there. I think some more needed to be communicated. As far as the officiating, I mean, I didn't think it was terrible on the whole. The flagrant foul, I mean, that was a bad call. That was a bad call. It was a foul. It should have been a foul, and it's a foul because he's grabbing Jamarius Burton's arm, right? Jamarius Burton hits him in the nose because he's trying to pull his arm away from the Duke player. The Duke player who grabbed his arm and fouled him, he's trying to pull his arm away. And you say it was after the whistle. If someone's grabbing your arm, are you just going to let them keep grabbing it because there's a whistle? And I mean, I would like to see it in real time with the whistle and see how long after the whistle it was that Jamarius Burton pulled his arm away. If someone's grabbing your arm, you pull it away. Whistle or not. And the elbow hit the nose because he was pulling it away. Right? So I don't understand how that turned into a flagrant foul. So it ends up being 2 points for Duke plus the ball. Or, well, I mean, I guess they got 1 point on the technical free throws. It was a dead ball technical. So they got 1 point out of that because Filipowski only made 1 out of 2. And then they got the ball and they ended up going to the free throw line and getting 2 more. So that's 3 points that Duke got out of it. Plus the 2 that Pitt possibly could have got out of it with Burton driving to the basket because he beat his guy. So, I mean, you're looking at potentially a 5-point swing there. Who knows how that makes the end of the game look? Who knows if that makes anything look different if Pitt, instead of Duke scoring 3, Pitt scores 2. I thought that was a really bad call. Overall, there wasn't too much else. There are bad calls every game. Here's the thing about officiating. This goes for football. This goes for basketball. It goes for every sport. All right. We have the technology to look at these plays in super slow motion and high definition. And we're finding out, and we've been finding out for the last 20 years, maybe 15, that these things that happen in a split second are almost imperceptible to the human eye in real time. It's almost impossible to see it happening as it's happening, right? And so these calls are made based on what the refs perceive. And we can go back and look at the slow motion and the high def and see, no, they were exactly wrong or they were exactly right or this or that. And that's not to excuse anything. It's to make the point that the human eye is, very much, unreliable at times. And so there are bad calls all over the place. I thought that was an egregious bad call. I think there were 1 or 2 others that were questionable, but that one I think had a huge impact. There was another one. There was a charge, right? That there was. I think there were at least 2 Duke charges that should have been called. There was the one that ended up being a foul on Blake Hinson. He somehow got a blocking foul called while he's laying on the ground, which is a pretty interesting one. He took a charge, and then a foul was called after the charge that he pretty clearly took, I thought. And they initially called the foul on Guillermo Diaz-Graham. They changed it to Blake Hinson, and you heard Jeff Gable say, how could it be on 2? He was laying on the ground. And I think I kind of agree with that. It wasn't anything egregiously bad. There were a few. There were pretty bad calls. But I can't put a collapse like this in the second half on the officiating. I think Pitt bears the brunt of the blame for this defeat. Let's see, do we have any super chatters in here? I want to get to all the comments and questions. I do, before we jump into that, I want to tell you about our friend Chris Gates. Now, hopefully you got a chance to join ChrisGatesFitness.com. You know about Chris Gates. I've told you about him. He's a huge Pitt fan. He's an online fitness coach from Pittsburgh. He works with people all over the world to create customized fitness and nutrition programs that work. He loves supporting the Wednesday live show every week. He's been a sponsor with us for quite a while now, and we appreciate him for that. And you might remember, we talked about this last week. He opened up coaching applications last week. But even though the application period has come and passed, it ended a couple days ago, you can still benefit from tons of free content that Chris creates every week. So, get subscribed to his mailing list. You got to go to his website first, ChrisGatesFitness.com. Chris, C-H-R-I-S, Gates, G-A-T-E-S, fitness.com. Go to his website, subscribe to his mailing list. He publishes new articles and podcasts every week. And then every Monday, he sends out an email update with the latest content. Go check that out, and you actually get a free 21-day program as a thank you for signing up. So do that tonight. Go over to ChrisGatesFitness.com, click on the mailing list button, and you can get signed up. If you've been considering changes in your lifestyle, your fitness, your health, your nutrition, Chris can guide you And if he can't guide you with a very specific customized program for you, he's got a whole lot of resources that I think are going to help you along your journey. So go to chrisgatesfitness.com, and believe me, you're going to look at his stuff, you're going to love it, and you're going to want to know when he reopens those coaching applications, because I think you're going to want to get on board with the stuff that Chris is doing. He's great. chrisgatesfitness.com. And we thank Chris for supporting the podcast. He's awesome. Let's get through comments and questions here, see what you guys are talking about in the wake of this game, 77-69 loss. Mike S. says the Duke refs need barred from doing games. I think you're always going to assume that, it always feels like Duke gets all the calls at home, and I don't think that's always, I don't think that's always a false impression. I think there's often some truth to that. But at the same time, like I said, I didn't think it was horrible. There were a couple bad calls, but I didn't think the game on a whole was called horribly. But Old Bandit says, bring back the Big East. That was a tough one to watch with all the fouls. How many fouls total were called in this game? Let me see. Pitt had 21. Yeah, Duke had 21. 42 fouls. It's a fair amount. There's a lot of fouls in the game. TVax1 says, was it poor coaching or did the Pitt players tighten up through most of the second half? Probably a little bit of both. I think Duke adjusted. I think Duke made some adjustments in how they were defending Pitt, and they were good adjustments. They effectively cut off the things that Jamarius Burton and Nelly Cummings wanted to do the most. And so much of the success that Pitt was having in the first half, so much of the success that they've had so far this season came from Jamarius Burton and Nelly Cummings doing the things they were doing, driving into the lane and either finishing or pulling up for a jumper or kicking out. And Duke was able to defend those things well by putting size on those guys. Rather than leaving their guards out there, their young guards out there to try and defend Burton and Cummings, they put size on those guys and said, all right, if you're going to drive, you're going to run into this guy's chest or stomach. You know what I mean? Because he's a lot bigger than you. And good luck shooting over that. And so Duke adjusted, and Pitt needed a counter. Pitt needed a way to adjust back to it and find ways to get opportunities. And it was too stagnant. I mean, it wasn't moving. I think you watch possession after possession, there's one guy dribbling the ball and nobody else is moving around. And that's not a recipe for good basketball, no matter who you're playing, no matter where you're playing, and no matter what the matchup looks like. It's not a good recipe. It's not a recipe for good basketball and winning basketball. And that's what they ran into. Whereas I think in the first half, they were moving the ball around. They were kicking it out. They were driving and passing. There was ball movement, and it was more effective. And it also helped that Duke was shooting itself in the foot by, committing 12 turnovers and, cutting off its own scoring opportunities that way. Let's see. Astro X Drip says, man, that is an awful loss. Pitt is not back. No paint presence and the defense abysmal. Well, first of all, the Pitt is back. Pitt is not back. I complained about this a week or two ago. It's like the talk of Pitt is back, whether it was after the Carolina game or the Virginia game. I think I try to make the point of like, chill with it. Okay. Chill. It's like 3 games into the ACC schedule, 4 games into the ACC schedule. There's a lot of games left to play. And that's not to say that, hey, that other shoe is going to drop. What it is to say is just take it for what it is right now, which is a team that's playing really, really well, which is what they were when they, opened the ACC schedule 4-0. They were a team playing really well. Take it for what it is. Look at the strengths of this team, look at the weaknesses of this team. Don't try to put it in context, the bigger context of the program or the history of the program or anything like that. Don't talk about Pitt is back, Pitt is not back, Pitt is this, Pitt is that. Right now, what is Pitt in this season? And Pitt is a pretty good ACC team. And now they've had 2 pretty rough games. How do they rebound? How do they bounce back? How do they move forward after a loss like that? Like I say, we've talked a lot about leadership and veteran presence and experience. Well, they're going to need that right now. They're going to need that togetherness and the good locker room culture and all those things we've heard about, all those things that appear to have been on display for the bulk of this season. They're going to need those things now because they're going to put themselves in a really difficult position if they lose on Saturday to Georgia Tech. I don't like to call a game a must win, particularly when it's like the 7th game out of a 20-game schedule, but this is a really important game. And they need to get a victory down there just to get back on track and reestablish themselves as a team that's in the top half of the ACC. And I don't think they've fallen out of the top half of the ACC, but they need to reestablish that they are. They need to sort of reconfirm that they're in that position. And I think they've got the players to do it. I think they've got the leadership to do it. The inside presence, no. Without John Hughley playing at 100% or something close to it, they don't have a great inside presence. You're absolutely right about that. They don't have that. And I don't know if or when John Hughley's going to be back. I don't know. But they won't have it until he gets back. What they'll have is some guys with some real length who should be able to use that length to help rebound and maybe be kind of tough defensively, but they're going to get beat up physically. They're going to get pushed around physically because they don't have the size, the strength and the size to really play at that level. Filipowski, Young, these are big guys, not just tall, but big guys. Even though Filipowski's a freshman, he's still bigger, he's thicker, he's stronger than Federico and Guillermo Diaz-Graham. But those are the guys that you have to roll with while you don't have John Hughley. It's what it is. And you have to find ways to play without relying on that kind of post presence. And they've found ways to play without relying on that kind of post presence. They've found ways to win without relying on that kind of post presence. It's just who they are this season. And there's nothing you can do about it now other than hope for John Hughley to come back. And maybe when Hughley comes back, maybe it makes a positive impact. If he comes back this season, and I have no idea if he's going to or not. But if he comes back this season, maybe he positively impacts, that part of the floor and helps you take some steps forward with his post presence. But in the meantime, you're going to rely on the guys that you have, and you have to figure out ways to play with those guys. You have to play a certain style if that's what that's who your centers are, and that's what they look like. TVAX1 says no true point guard and really only 2 decent improving inside players to rotate in makes it extremely difficult. I think Nelly Cummings didn't have a great game tonight. He actually missed quite a bit of time in the first half. He sat out for a pretty good stretch in the first half. How many minutes did he play? Cummings played 15 minutes in the first half. Burton played 13 minutes in the first half. Burton with 2 fouls. Cummings had 1 foul, but he sat for a little while. He's 1 of 5 from the floor. He was better in the second half. Played 18 minutes, 4 of 6 from the floor. 2 turnovers, no assists, though. That's obviously not very good. Plus 3 fouls, all in the second half. I think this team, with Nelly Cummings running the point, Jamarius Burton and Greg Elliott and Blake Hinson on the floor, or sub in Nike Sabandian somewhere, for Greg Elliott. I think that's a good enough lineup. It's in terms of the guys that you're going to rely on to score, that you're going to run plays for, and you're going to hopefully operate your offense through. I think that's a good enough lineup. I think Nelly Cummings is a good enough point guard. I think he can be a playmaking point guard. And there were times when he was. He made some shots in the second half. He was basically the only guy who made shots in the second half. And he made some big shots. When they broke that field goal drought of 8 minutes without a made basket, it was Cummings who hit a 3 to do it. And so, I think he's fine as a point guard. I don't put that high on the list of issues here. I think it was a bigger issue that they didn't adjust well to what Duke did defensively in the second half. I think that's a bigger issue, or that was a bigger issue, in this game tonight. Let's see. Bill Florigen, Super Chatter, says could have really used Hughley in this game. I think so. I think just to have more of a physical presence down low, more of a rebounding presence down low. I think Duke still would have had a pretty good rebounding advantage, but Hughley probably could have cut into it a decent amount. You know what I mean? Grab some more offensive rebounds for Pitt to get some second chance opportunities, which I don't think they ended up with many of those. Pitt had 8 second chance points on 9 offensive rebounds. That's not very productive at that end of the court. And it's because of who you were playing against and the matchups there. And the matchups still probably would have favored Duke even with John Hughley, but you would have probably gotten more than 9 offensive rebounds. You probably would have gotten more than, what did I say it was? 8 second chance points. You probably would have ended up with more than that. But you don't have Hughley. He's not out there, and you have to figure out how to play without him. And they've figured out how to play without him. And in a bunch of games, they've been able to win while playing without him. And even against Carolina with Armando Bacot, they were able to figure out how to play without him. This game, they probably could have used him. Let's see. Some more comments and questions in here. TVAX1 says, credit Federico and Guillermo Diaz-Graham, but then with Hinson is just not enough inside. If Hughley doesn't return and would need to be far better than when he left, it's going to be tough for the remainder. Yeah, I mean, here's my thing. And it's hard when you watch a game like this where they were really kind of dominated for 20 minutes in the second half. It's hard to sort of think this way, and I understand that because I fall into this trap myself. But, that 20 minutes doesn't undo everything else that they did this season. You know what I mean? The first 4 games didn't define them. The next 12 games or whatever it is, was 11 games. The first 4 games defined them for what they were in those 4 games. The next 11 games define them, I think, more of who they actually are. And then these last 2 games have shown the challenges of playing in conference play and maybe the demands, and what it's going to require of them to continue winning in conference play, which they started off doing pretty well. I mean, the NC State game still counts. The Syracuse game counts. The Carolina and Virginia games count. And they did all those things, for the most part, without Hughley. Right? So it's not like this team can't win without John Hughley. I think John Hughley's absence just makes certain matchups more difficult. And not necessarily every matchup in the ACC, but some, like tonight, are certainly more difficult without a guy like Hughley. Panther Room says, we have a good team, but we need a big man down low to get rebounds. Hopefully when Big John comes back, he could be a role player and take that position. I mean, that would be ideal. It's just a question of when he's going to come back. Evan D402 says, the fact that officiating was that bad, we missed almost every shot in the last 12 minutes, but still had a chance to win is a good thing. Go 4-0 till Miami, and we're set. Granted, that probably won't happen. It's interesting. I mean, for as bad as they played, they were still down by 4 with 1:47 to go. They were down by 4 with 1:03 to go. But, I mean, 1:47, you're down 71-67. You're down 4 points, with a little less than 2 minutes. You've got an opportunity there. You just have to get a stop on defense, and they didn't. I forget who made the basket, but he drove. I wrote down that he drove on Blake Hinson and scored. And so even when they came down the other end and Jamarius Burton drove and made it 73-69, there was only 1:03 left, and it was hard to come back from 4 points at that point. You needed to make a stop. Oh, to your point, they played really poorly in the second half, went a long stretch without a made basket, went a long stretch without a point, and still, with a little under 2 minutes to go, it was a 4-point game, and they had an opportunity to still kind of pull out the win. And so, I mean, I would say, sure, that's encouraging to some extent. I think there's a few things you can look at this game where in the first half, Duke has 12 turnovers, Pitt only gets like 8 points out of it. If they capitalize more there, maybe they give themselves more of a cushion and they're able to hold on. I think in the second half, you go 8 minutes without a made field goal, 7 minutes without a single point. If you score at least just a couple times in there, if you're just bad, not horrific, you know what I mean? If you're just mediocre and not terrible during that stretch, you probably give yourself enough of a cushion to hold on and win. And then again, you get one stop while you're down 4 with 1.5 minutes to go. Who knows? If you come back down, whatever you hit, if you make a basket, you've got it down to a 1-possession game, and now things are really interesting. One mistake by Duke, and they've shown throughout the night that they were very prone to mistakes. One mistake by Duke has you winning the game. And so for all of their poor play, I mean, it took Pitt playing god-awful basketball for Duke to win this game. Right? I mean, it took Pitt playing god-awful basketball for this outcome, to arrive at this outcome. And they still almost had a chance to pull it out despite playing god-awful basketball. If they just play average basketball, there's probably a decent chance that they win, which I think probably is a bit to the credit of this team or speaks to the potential of this team, on most nights. Will Z says, bad loss. Team totally didn't know what to do for 9 minutes. Offensive sets were awful. Fetty, Diaz-Graham couldn't rebound at all. Worst coaching performance other than West Virginia. Coaching can't go into a shell when the officiating gets bad. I think they needed to coach better in the second half. I would agree. Unless they were coaching and the players weren't doing what they were supposed to do, but that would seem to be out of character for these particular players. Look, I suppose there's probably at least a possibility that Jamarius Burton and Nelly Cummings thought they just needed to take the game over. And to their credit, there have been a number of occasions this season where they have just taken a game over and pulled Pitt out of a slump or pulled Pitt into a comeback or what have you. And so maybe they just took it upon themselves and thought they needed to be the guys. And, again, Nelly Cummings went 4 of 6, but I think there were, he had 3 turnovers in the second half and no assists. I mean, some of these drives and isolation plays that they were trying to run resulted in turnovers, or missed baskets and defensive rebounds for Duke. I do think coaching left something to be desired in the second half. I would agree about that. I think they needed to do a better job of getting Pitt into some kind of offensive sets, running something to counter what Duke was doing. Because, I mean, just looking at it from out here, not knowing what Jeff Capel was telling his guys to do, I mean, Shire outcoached Capel in the second half. Just based on, watching it from here and watching how Duke was able to take over that game. Sticky Bandit says, pass the ball. I agree. Panther Room says, Federico and the Twins do a great job down low, but they're just not big enough. Seems like they got worn down in the second half against these last 2 teams. To some extent. I think... I think I'll say this for Federico and Guillermo Diaz-Graham. I mean, they're not dogging it. Those guys are getting into it. They're going as hard as they can. They're fighting. They're battling. They got outplayed tonight. Severely. They had no chance. And to some extent, guys like them are playing at a disadvantage when they, at least in terms of going for offensive rebounds, when they play on a team that fires up as many threes as Pitt does. It creates a lot of long rebounds, makes things kind of difficult for those guys down low. It's not the same as, trying to rebound off of layups or pull up jump shots, or things inside, closer to the basket. But I mean, they had no chance against, Filipowski, who, what did he finish with? Filipowski finished with 15 rebounds. Young had 10. Mitchell had 9. I mean, they just had no chance against those guys. Those guys were too dominant there. And they're going to be dominant against a lot of teams and a lot of players, but against guys who are as skinny as them, as Jorge or Guillermo Diaz-Graham and Federico, guys who don't have that kind of strength, they're going to really have their way. And that's what they did. Let's see. Scrolling down here, see what people are saying. A lot of people talking about John Hughley. Like I said, Willat Harris says, I thought 17-foot step-back jumpers were a staple of everyone's game. It was interesting to hear the announcers talk about how, those step-back jumpers, that's just part of Pitt's game. And, if you're Nelly Cummings, that's what you have to do when you have a taller player guarding you. You have to run that step back. I mean, that's great, but you're not trying to do it every possession down the court. You need to have something. You need to run an offense. And I'm sure Jeff Capel, if he was sitting here listening to me this, he'd say, dude, you're a moron. Like, what are you talking about? We run this or we run that. Like I say, Steven Gertz is going to do a video breakdown. He's going to show some of the things that they tried to run, I'm sure. But sitting here, watching the game, I'm saying, what are they doing? What's the plan here? What are they even attempting to do here? Set a screen and try and drive on it. Well, you set a screen, with Federico, and they switch off, and now you have Filipowski on Nelly Cummings or on Jamarius Burton, and if Burton and Cummings can't get around him, they're stuck. You can't shoot over him, and now you're really jammed up, and you got to find somewhere to pass. And I mean, they end up with like cross court passes, and it wasn't there weren't good passes coming out of those situations. There weren't good shots coming out of those situations. It was a defensive adjustment by Duke without a counter by Pitt. Let's scroll down. Chris Peak, is that a Casio wristwatch? No, I don't think so. It's the old. It's the 2020s equivalent of the Casio wristwatch. It's the Apple Watch that constantly buzzes during these shows and shows me all the text messages and emails that I'm missing while I'm talking to you guys. Anthony Tennyson says, I know people are mad, and so am I, because they went 2-2. Most would have taken that against these four teams, 1-3, but it would have been nice to go 3-1. They're still there for a great turnaround season. Yeah, I mean, like, this is the same thing. This is the thing. I mean, the things that got them to this point, right? The things that got them to a 4-0 start. The skills on display, what the players were doing, what they were doing well. I mean, those things all still exist, right? Nelly Cummings is still Nelly Cummings. Jamarius Burton is still Jamarius Burton. Blake Hinson, Sparks Sabandi. I mean, these guys are still, Greg Elliott. They're still who they are, right? That hasn't changed. Okay, is our expectation right now, in the wake of two rough games, that those individual players are just going to fall off a cliff? Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about how Jamarius Burton is one of the best players in the ACC right now. That Blake Hinson was an ACC Player of the Week and was one of the best players in the ACC. Do we not believe those things anymore? We might say that, okay, they're one of the best. They're not the best. Jamarius Burton might not be the best player in the ACC, but do we not believe that he's still one of the best? He had a rough game. Everybody had a rough game for Pitt. Everybody has a rough game sometimes. Do we not still believe that these are some quality players? Do we not still believe that this team was built in a certain way that was, for the most part, working this season? I understand disappointment from a loss, and it was a disappointing loss and missed opportunity. There's no question about it. But and not that there's a lot of comments out there that the season is doomed, but the season is not doomed. There are a lot of games left to be played, and a lot of opportunity still exists out there. Scrolling through here. See what else anybody has to say. Before we jump out, a lot of comments. You guys are all Chevy Troutman. I don't believe it's the actual Chevy Troutman. Says, how long until Nate Santos can crack 15% from deep? Nate Santos, look, plus minus is not a good stat in basketball, all right? That leaves a lot to be desired. But Nate Santos, plus 10 tonight in his, how many minutes did he play? 9 minutes of play. Pitt was plus 10 with Nate Santos on the court. Plus 15 with Nate Santos on the court against Clemson. I thought they got solid minutes out of Nate Santos. He only played in the first half. I don't think he played in the second half. No, he played 1 minute in the second half. Played 8 minutes in the first half. Went 1 of 4 from the field. Hit a free throw. Scored 3 points. Had 1 rebound, 1 assist, and 1 steal. His assist was a great play. His basket was a great play. I mean, I think Nate Santos can give you something. I think he's a pretty solid defender. I think he's aggressive on the rebounds. I think he plays a little bit bigger than he is. I think he's able to get in there. The dish to Guillermo Diaz-Graham I thought was a really nice play. And he's taking good shots. He's he's not forcing bad shots. And I'm still inclined to think those shots are going to fall. If he continues to take them. He's not a guy that you're going to start over any of the starting five right now. And you're not going to put him in for more minutes than Blake Hinson unless there's foul trouble, or more minutes than Burton unless there's foul trouble. But as a role as the seventh or eighth guy off the bench, with Sparks Sabandi as your sixth guy off the bench, and then Santos and Guillermo Diaz-Graham as those next guys, depending on what position you need to reserve. I mean, I'll take that. I think he fits well in that role. I think he's pretty good at it, actually. So I think Nate Santos has been solid, particularly in these last two games. I think he's given Pitt solid minutes and hasn't been the reason they lost in either game. But that's just me. I mean, he needs to obviously make some of these shots. He's taking good shots. He needs some of them to actually fall. All right, what else you guys got? Let's see. You guys are just sort of arguing with each other. That's always fun. Let's see if there's anything else. You guys are just arguing about John Hughley. All right, I'll let you keep. I'll let you keep arguing about it. And in the meantime, it's a loss. It's a disappointing loss, and it's a missed opportunity. I think I understand if you're concerned about them teetering on the edge of another January, February collapse. I understand if you want to wait and see till the end of the season, before you pass judgment. I'm all in favor of that, actually. Like, if you're sitting there saying, I'll believe in Capel when he shows me he can get through the month of February without collapsing, I'm all for that. I'm all for not making grand statements and broad declarations based off of each game or each half or each stretch of games. I'm all for taking each game individually. I'm all for looking at each game as one part of the season and how they build, move forward or regress from one game to the next. And like I said, this next stretch coming up is huge. I think this is a really important stretch for the team for this season. I think they have a great chance to bounce back on Saturday with a road win against Georgia Tech. I think that opportunity is right out there for them. And it'll be a big game and a big opportunity. They blew an opportunity here tonight, and I think they know that. They know they blew an opportunity on Saturday against Clemson. They have a chance to sort of break that negative momentum and get things headed back in the right direction on Saturday. And after that, they'll have a chance again against Louisville, and after that, they'll have a chance again against Florida State. And if they can, if they go 2-1 in that stretch, they're what, 6-3? Realistically, if they could win that stretch, you get 7-2. Heading into the midpoint of the ACC schedule, you're in pretty good shape, because even 8-2 or 7-3 after 10 games is a pretty good spot to be in. And so, like I say, disappointing game, missed opportunity. Still believe in a lot of pieces that are on this team. A lot of the way this team was put together still seems like it's a viable way to win games. So. We'll see what they do. While you're here, make sure you like this video. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Right here, you'll never miss any of our live streams or any of the videos we post each morning. Our morning pit, Monday through Friday, every day of the week. At least every weekday, we post a new video here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications. You'll get an alert sent to your phone every time we post something new, or every time we go live for a Wednesday night live Panther-Lair show or a post-game show, whatever it is that we do, right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So like this video and subscribe, then head over to Panther-Lair.com, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com to stay up to date on all the latest Pitt sports news, football, basketball, and recruiting. Right there, Panther-Lair.com. Thanks so much for tuning in to the post-game show tonight. We'll have a new morning pit for you tomorrow, of course. And lots of content on Panther-Lair.com and right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So Pitt loses to Duke. Disappointing loss, but they'll have a chance to make up for it on Saturday, or at least to break the negative momentum on Saturday and bounce back and try to start building up some positive momentum again we'll see what happens then. Until then, have a great, hope you had a great Wednesday, and we will talk to you again tomorrow morning for the Morning Pit right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.